Welcome to the Eclipse Horror Stories. If you are new here, please and subscribe this channel. It hadn't even been a month since it happened, but it still felt raw whenever I thought about it. I'm a senior in high school, born and raised in Nevada, and I've always been the type to chase places most people ignore. With nothing much to do around here, my friends and I got into urban exploring, slipping through broken fences, crawling into abandoned malls, climbing up old rooftops, sometimes even sneaking into service tunnels. It was never about breaking things or being reckless. We just liked the strange silence of forgotten spaces, the way dust clung to everything, the feeling that we'd stepped into a place time forgot. The one who always pushed us further was Charles. He wasn't loud or outgoing. If anything, he was quiet and a little mysterious. He'd show up with these locations none of us had ever heard about. I never asked how he found them, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. One afternoon, he sent us a screenshot from some weird Instagram account. It looked sketchy as hell, low follower count, blurry photos, cryptic captions with creepy comments under them. The post that caught his eye mentioned dozens of abandoned mine shafts in the Mojave Desert. The caption said, "If you know where to look." That was all Charles needed. He'd already been messaging whoever ran the account, and they apparently gave him coordinates to check out. It was enough to get him obsessed. By the weekend, he'd convinced me and our other friend, James, to drive out there. I had a Wrangler that handled dirt roads well, so naturally, I was the one who ended up driving us into the middle of nowhere. We didn't have a real address, just a pin dropped on an offline map Charles had saved. The spot looked like nothing, just a point in the endless desert. The main road disappeared behind us almost half an hour earlier, and the so-called path we followed barely looked like a road anymore. Sand, rocks, brush. It felt like we were driving into a place no one was supposed to go. James was in the back, getting irritated the longer we drove. "This is a waste of time," he said more than once, accusing Charles of being scammed by some troll online. But Charles wouldn't hear it. He just stared at the map like it was a treasure map. I didn't feel like arguing, so I kept driving, though every mile deeper into that desert gave me a feeling I couldn't shake. When we were close to calling it quits, James suddenly leaned forward and pointed to the right. At first, I thought it was nothing more than rocks piled against a slope, but when I drove closer, I saw it. Part of a collapsed wooden frame built into the side of the earth. It wasn't much, but behind those beams was a dark opening. A mine shaft. Charles didn't say a word at first. He just pulled out his phone, dropped a pin on the map, and finally turned to James with a quiet, "Told you." James rolled his eyes, but I knew even he felt the shock of it. We'd been circling for hours, lost in the desert, and somehow Charles's obsession led us here. I parked a few yards away. The air was dry and empty, like the world had been hollowed out. Charles had even brought masks, claiming we might need them for dust. The three of us walked toward the entrance, and up close, it looked even more dangerous than from a distance. Parts of the frame were cracked. Dirt was piled against one side, and the hole was black as pitch. Charles picked up a rock and tossed it inside. For a moment, silence. Then, clink, clink, clink. The sound echoed down for what felt like forever. "Deep," Charles muttered. Then, without hesitation, he started heading in. I wanted to laugh it off, say we shouldn't go inside, but James was already following, grumbling under his breath. I adjusted my mask and clicked on my flashlight. The beam lit only a small circle ahead, and the rest was swallowed by shadows. The slope went down at a sharp angle, covered in loose dirt and old beams pressed into the walls. They creaked faintly under the weight of time, but somehow they still held. The deeper we went, the colder it got. The silence pressed in until it was almost painful, broken only by the crunch of our steps. I glanced back once, but the entrance was already gone, swallowed by darkness. We eventually reached a wider tunnel, the kind you see in old mining photos, rails half buried in dust, wooden supports every few feet, scraps of tools left to rot. It smelled stale, like air that hadn't moved in years. We didn't talk much. It felt wrong to speak. The further we went, the more it seemed like we weren't supposed to be there. Then came the sound. Faint at first, so faint I thought it was in my head. A dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I stopped. Charles stopped, too. Even James froze. He motioned for us to turn off our flashlights, and we did. In the darkness, the noise came again, clearer this time. Scraping, uneven, like metal or wood dragged across dirt. And it was closer. We stood frozen, waiting, every second stretching like an hour. Then James's flashlight flicked on for a split second, and the scraping stopped. The beam cut through the dark for only a heartbeat, but it was enough to jolt all of us. The light hit the tunnel walls, caught on the rusted rails, and then snapped back to black. My chest tightened, and I swear I could hear how loud my own breathing was inside the mask. The scraping had stopped. Total silence now. Not even the sound of shifting dirt or the faint echoes we'd been hearing earlier. Just black, endless silence. I wanted to whisper to James, ask him what the hell he was thinking, but before I could, a noise tore through the tunnel. A metallic crash, so loud it rang in my ears, like something heavy being dropped hard against steel. The sound came from deeper in the shaft, past the reach of where our lights could ever go. And then came the scream. It wasn't a human scream. It was sharp and guttural, like an animal in pain, but stretched into something unnatural. It bounced off every wall until it was impossible to tell which direction it came from. The sound went straight through me, made every hair on my arms stand up. James didn't wait. He bolted. His flashlight swung wildly as he ran, bouncing beams of light over the rails and beams and walls. Charles was right behind him, and I had no choice but to follow. The ground was uneven, my boots slipping on loose dirt, but adrenaline shoved me forward. Somewhere behind us, footsteps echoed. Heavy, quick, almost on top of mine. I didn't dare look back. I was too scared that if I turned my head, I'd actually see something chasing me. The incline came into view, that long slope we'd crawled down minutes before. Charles was halfway up already, James scrambling right after him. My foot caught on a piece of wood sticking out of the dirt, and I fell hard, face first. Pain shot up my leg, and when I scrambled to my knees, I realized one of my shoes had come off. I thought about going back for it, but then the footsteps thundered closer, and I knew I didn't have time. Barefoot on one foot, I started climbing. Every step was agony. The boards were jagged, splinters stabbing into my skin. My sock tore open within seconds. But the noise behind me didn't stop. The pounding steps, the echo of something heavy scraping the walls as if it was dragging along the sides of the tunnel as it ran. Charles reached the top first, gasping as he pulled himself out into the night air. James followed, turning back to yell something I couldn't even hear over the rush of blood in my ears. My body was running on nothing but fear and adrenaline, forcing me to keep climbing despite the stabbing pain shooting through my foot. I don't know how I made it out, but somehow I did. I stumbled into the open desert, falling hard on my hands and knees. Charles and James grabbed me, pulling me toward the Wrangler. I barely managed to slam the door shut before James jumped into the driver's seat and floored it. The tires spun in the dirt, throwing up a cloud of dust as the mine shrank in the rearview mirror. No one spoke. We were too busy listening, waiting for something to come out after us. But the desert stayed empty, and eventually, the only sound was the engine straining as James pushed the Jeep as fast as it could go over uneven dirt roads. By the time we reached pavement, my foot was throbbing so bad I could barely keep my eyes open. We went straight to the hospital, and I ended up with a tetanus shot, bandaged wounds, and strict instructions to stay off my feet for a few days. The pain didn't really sink in until later that night, when the adrenaline was gone and all I could think about was the sound of those footsteps behind me. For days, I could still hear them in my head whenever it got too quiet. I thought that was the end of it. I thought we'd all agree never to bring it up again. But then, a few days later, James came over, looking pale. He told us he'd dropped his wallet near the mine entrance when he was helping me to the car. He hadn't said anything that night, but now he wanted to go back. Just for the wallet. Just to the entrance. Against my better judgment, I went with them. We found the spot easily with the pin Charles had saved. The sun was low, painting the desert in long shadows as we approached. The mine looked the same, silent, gaping, as if nothing had ever happened inside. The wallet wasn't there, but my shoe was. It sat a few feet from the entrance, the one I'd lost when I tripped. The sight of it made my stomach twist. I limped closer, half wanting to grab it, half wanting to turn around and run. When I picked it up, my hands went cold. The shoe was torn apart, like something had chewed into it. Teeth marks were clear, deep, and wide. Entire chunks of the fabric were missing. I dropped it and backed away. None of us said a word, but we didn't need to. We all knew what we were thinking. Something had followed us up that tunnel, and maybe it hadn't gone back in. I thought I'd be able to forget about that night if I just forced myself not to think about it. But the desert has a way of following you, sticking to you long after you've left it behind. A week later, I was still limping when a friend of mine, someone I trusted enough to open up to, told me his own story about the desert. Hearing him speak, I realized I wasn't the only one who had felt something out there that couldn't be explained. He'd always been an outdoors kind of guy, the type who found peace in long hikes and camping trips instead of city lights and noise. His girlfriend, Tiki, shared that same love for being out in the wild. He said the two of them had done forests, mountains, lakes, but never the desert. That dry silence, that endless horizon, felt like something they had to try at least once. They picked a spot known for stargazing, hours away from any towns or light pollution. No amenities, no campsites with bathrooms or firewood bundles, just open land. They wanted isolation. They wanted nothing but each other, the fire and the stars. The first couple nights were exactly that. Warm days, cool nights, skies so clear you could see layers of stars piled on each other. They sat by the fire, shared a drink, laughed about nothing, sometimes just lay on the ground and stared upward until their necks hurt. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you've stepped outside of time. But both nights, as they settled into their tent, they heard something strange, a sound carrying faintly over the desert. At first, he thought it was an animal, a drawn-out moan, low and strange, like a howl that didn't quite belong to any animal he knew. Coyotes, maybe. Mountain lions, if they were unlucky. But the sound lingered, stretching unnaturally before fading back into silence. He admitted the first time it rattled him, but he didn't want to spook Tiki, so he laughed it off. They did the same the second night, chalking it up to desert wildlife. But he couldn't shake the way it made his stomach twist. On the third night, the sound didn't come from far away. It came right outside their tent. He said he woke to the crunch of footsteps on dry dirt. Slow, steady, one after another, no rush to them at all. It wasn't an animal. He was sure of that. The steps stopped just a few feet away from the thin fabric wall separating them from whatever stood outside. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe too loud, afraid that one wrong sound would bring whatever it was crashing into the tent. For a long time, there was nothing, just silence pressing in. Then he heard it, the flick of a lighter. Through the thin wall of the tent, an orange glow appeared, small at first, hovering waist-high in the dark. Whoever was outside held it steady, then began to wave it slowly from side to side. He watched the glow move, terrified to even blink. And then the flame grew. Not just a flicker anymore, but the glow of something bigger, brighter. A torch, a piece of cloth wrapped around wood. He could see the light through the fabric of the tent. He said his whole body screamed at him to do something, but he still couldn't move. Until the torch dropped. The dull thump came first, then the heat, spreading faster than he ever thought possible. The side of the tent glowed with orange fire. Flames climbed upward, smoke curling instantly inside. That was when he finally broke out of the frozen haze. He shook Tiki awake, and she jolted up with wide eyes, realizing immediately what was happening. They scrambled to throw their stuff outside, kicking gear into the dirt. Tiki grabbed a jug of water and dumped it over the fire, stomping out burning patches of fabric. He said he was stomping too, his foot pressing into glowing embers, the smell of melted plastic filling the air. They barely got it under control, half the tent ruined, blackened, burned through. He grabbed a flashlight and swept it wildly through the desert around them. But there was nothing, just empty space, stretching in every direction. That was when Tiki said, "We're leaving." Now, they packed fast, throwing what they could into the truck, not caring if they forgot things. They started walking toward where they thought the truck was parked, but in the dark desert, every direction looked the same. 10 minutes passed, maybe more, before he heard it again. The howl. Only this time, it didn't sound like one voice. It sounded like many, and it wasn't far away. The sound came first as one long scream in the distance, but then it was joined by another, and another. A chorus of cries that rose and fell in uneven waves, echoing across the flat desert. He said it didn't sound like coyotes anymore. Coyotes yip, they bark, they howl short. This was different, longer, sharper, almost like something in pain. Something trying to carry itself across the night. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed Tiki's arm and pulled her faster, the flashlight beam shaking across the dirt as they half walked, half ran. She kept asking him if it was animals, if they should hide, but he didn't answer. He didn't want to admit what he was thinking, that whatever was making those sounds wasn't hunting the way animals do. It was chasing. The truck felt like a mile away, even though it couldn't have been more than a few hundred yards. Every step seemed to stretch longer, the glow of the stars above mocking how dark the ground around them was. He said his heart was pounding so hard he thought it would tear out of his chest. And then came the worst part. The cries didn't stay behind them. They shifted. One call came from the left, another from the right, then from ahead, faint but unmistakable. They were surrounded, the voices moving, circling, like whatever was out there had been waiting for them to leave the safety of the firelight. Tiki stumbled, nearly falling, but he yanked her up, whispering, "Don't stop. Don't stop." He couldn't explain why he whispered instead of shouting, but he knew in his gut that making noise would only make things worse. By some miracle, the beam of his flashlight finally caught something silver in the dark, the reflection of metal. The truck. Relief washed over him so hard he nearly collapsed, but he kept moving, pulling Tiki with him. They reached the vehicle, threw their bags into the back without caring if things fell out, and scrambled inside. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life, the sound almost too loud in the stillness. For a second, he was afraid it would draw whatever was out there closer. But nothing came. Not yet. He threw the truck into gear and floored it, headlights cutting a narrow path through the desert. The dirt road was rough, full of dips and rocks that threatened to throw them off balance, but he didn't care. Every second spent on that land felt like another chance for something to appear in the beams of his headlights. Tiki sat in the passenger seat, gripping the dashboard so tight her knuckles were white. She wasn't crying yet, but he could see it pressing at the edge of her control. She kept looking out the window, scanning the dark as if she might see shapes moving just beyond the reach of the light. The cries didn't stop. They followed, faint but constant, like echoes being dragged behind the truck. Sometimes they faded for a moment, only to rise again louder, closer. At one point, he swore he saw a movement in the rearview mirror, a shadow darting across the trail of dust kicked up by their tires. He blinked, and it was gone, but the image stuck with him. The road felt endless. Every bend looked like the last. But finally, the dirt gave way to pavement. He didn't slow down. He pressed harder, speeding into the night until the cries were gone and the desert was only a smear of black on either side. When other cars appeared, their lights small but steady on the horizon, he felt the first real wave of safety. He glanced at Tiki then, and that was when the tears broke free. She tried to hide it, covering her face with her hand, but he could hear her sobbing. He reached over and squeezed her knee. Though his own hands were shaking so badly, he almost lost control of the wheel. They didn't stop until they reached a town big enough to have a police station. He made the report, told them about the fire, the noises, the people, or things he thought were out there. The officer listened politely, nodded, wrote things down, but he could see in his face that he didn't believe a word of it. Later, back on the road, Tiki asked him the question he'd been avoiding since the first howl. What do you think it really was? He didn't answer, because the truth was he didn't know. All he knew was that if he hadn't woken up to those footsteps outside the tent, neither of them would have lived long enough to ask the question at all. By the time he finished telling me that story, I could feel the same chill I'd carried out of that mine crawl right back into me. I didn't tell him about my own night in the shaft. I didn't have to. We both understood that the desert keeps things it doesn't want anyone to explain. But I wasn't done hearing stories. Almost a year later, one more came to me, and it wasn't from a friend. It was from someone I knew well, someone who should have been safe. It was from my own family. I'd graduated college and was driving through Arizona on my way to meet an old classmate. The trip was long, flat, and empty, The kind of road that makes you cycle through music until you can't stand another song. Out of boredom, I started calling people. After a few tries, I rang up my mom. We always talked soccer, Champions League, rivalries, matches worth staying up for. It was easy, familiar. I was laughing about something she said when I saw two pickup trucks parked sideways across the road ahead. At first, I thought it might be an accident, but the way they sat there didn't feel right. I slowed, phone still pressed to my ear, and the world seemed to shrink into the headlights. Then doors opened. 3 men stepped out, each one carrying a gun. I froze. My mom's voice kept talking through the phone, but I couldn't form words. Another vehicle pulled up behind me, boxing me in. One of the men walked right up, tapped his gun against my door, and motioned for me to get out. I did what anyone unarmed would do. I put my hands up and stepped out slowly. The air felt sharp, thinner than before. They spoke in Spanish, sharp commands I couldn't follow. That was my failure. I'd never learned the language, not properly, not enough to understand what they wanted. But it didn't take much to guess. Within seconds, my wallet, keys, phone, and everything else were in their hands. One of them climbed into my truck. I thought that was it, that they'd take the car, leave me stranded, maybe worse. But then I noticed something strange. The man inside wasn't starting the engine. He was looking at my phone. The line with my mom was still open. For a moment, his hand moved like he was going to end the call. Then he stopped. He lifted the phone, pressed it to his ear. I couldn't hear what was said, but I watched his lips move. He was speaking Spanish, and he said one word over and over, one I knew even without understanding the language, a name. R. The same name I'd heard my mom whisper years ago when she thought no one was listening. The other 2 men came closer, listening as the one in my truck spoke to her. Their faces shifted from hard to curious, to something almost cautious. When the conversation ended, they handed me my things back. Every single one, even the keys. The only thing they kept was the cash from my wallet. Before leaving, one of them looked at me, gave a small smile, and in a heavy accent said, "Tax has been paid." Then they were gone, their trucks kicking up dust as they sped off the road into the desert. I stood there shaking, unable to move until I forced myself into the driver's seat and drove away. My mom called me back minutes later, her voice calm, telling me she'd threatened to call the police, that she'd tracked my location. But I knew she was lying. She'd been part of something deeper, something I wasn't supposed to touch. That was the last time I ever asked about her past. I didn't want to know how far it went, or how many people in the desert still remembered her name. Because the truth was, the desert wasn't just holding secrets buried in mine shafts or howling through the night. It was holding people, families, whole histories that could reach out and pull you in when you least expected it. And once you'd brushed against it, once you'd heard its voice, you never walked away clean. Not me, not my friend, not even my own mother.